Something came through the gate that Stargate Command had no protocol for. The wormhole at Cheyenne Mountain opened without any prior dialing sequence, without any authorized destination lock, and without any of the electromagnetic telemetry that accompanied every known species capable of using the Stargate network. The iris was sealed within milliseconds of activation, but whatever passed through the wormhole arrived on the other side of that iris without a scratch, without a sound, and without any apparent awareness that several inches of titanium alloy had just failed to stop it. The man standing in the gate room was short, unremarkable, wearing a white jumpsuit with a yellow cape and what appeared to be rubber boots, and he was looking around the blast-scarred military bunker with the detached expression of someone who had just entered a moderately disappointing grocery store. General Landry's voice came over the intercom demanding identification, and the man in the jumpsuit tilted his head slightly, glanced at the armed personnel surrounding him on every catwalk and platform, and responded with a single word that the base linguist would spend 3 days analyzing for hidden meaning. He said, "Huh." What Stargate Command did not yet understand, what none of them could have prepared for, was that the quiet, bored man standing in their most secure military installation was not a scout, not an ambassador, not a weapon deployed by any known or unknown alien civilization. He was something the Stargate universe had never encountered and had no category for, and that problem was only going to get worse. If you think Stargate Command can contain what just walked through that gate, you haven't been paying attention. Subscribe now, because what's coming next isn't a diplomatic incident. It's a complete structural collapse of everything the SGC thought it understood about power in this galaxy. The security footage from Gate Room Camera 4 would later be reviewed by 17 different analysts across 4 different government agencies, and not one of them could agree on what, exactly, they were looking at. The wormhole had activated at 3:47 hours on a Tuesday morning, which was already unusual because no off-world activation had been scheduled for that window, and the dialing computer had registered the incoming connection from an address that didn't match any planet in the SGC's cataloged network. The iris had snapped shut in the standard response time, fast enough to prevent anything larger than a molecule from passing through. And then something had stepped out of the event horizon anyway, walking through the titanium barrier the way most people walk through a bead curtain, not forcefully, not dramatically, just with the mild inconvenience of something being in the way that shouldn't have been there. Sergeant Chen, stationed at the primary security console, later described the moment in her incident report as the iris opening from the wrong side, which her supervisor marked as physically impossible in the margin, and then left alone because he couldn't come up with a better description either. What the cameras showed was a man, apparently a man, bipedal, human in proportions, dressed in civilian clothing that had no military or tactical purpose, stepping out of the wormhole with a mildly curious expression, and immediately looking up at the gate itself with the expression of someone noticing a large appliance they hadn't expected to find. He tilted his head. He looked at the chevrons. He knocked on one of the outer ring symbols with his knuckle, the way you'd knock on a wall to check if it was hollow, and the seismic sensors registered a reading that the geological team initially flagged as a minor tremor before correlating it with the knock. General Hank Landry reached the control room in under 90 seconds, which was fast for a man his age at 4 in the morning, and what he saw through the reinforced observation window did not immediately clarify the situation. The man in the gate room was now looking at the SG team assembled below him, 12 armed personnel in full tactical gear with weapons trained at center mass, with the same mild, unhurried interest he had given the gate itself. He was not afraid. He was not aggressive. He was not performing calm the way someone trying to de-escalate a tense situation performs calm. He simply appeared to find the whole thing mildly interesting in the way that a person finds a new bus route mildly interesting, which was a reaction that no one in that room had encountered before in a gate room situation, because the gate room was a place where things that arrived unannounced were either running from something or coming to start something, and this man appeared to be doing neither. "Who are you?" Landry's voice came through the intercom, firm and practiced, the voice of someone who had asked that question to gods and replicators and Goa'uld System Lords, and had learned not to be surprised by the answer. The man looked up at the observation window, located Landry immediately with no apparent difficulty, and his expression shifted in a way that several analysts would later describe as slightly less bored before shifting back. "Saitama," he said, which the base translation software flagged as a Japanese surname with no known alien linguistic correlation, which only deepened the confusion because the alternative, that this person was simply a Japanese man who had walked through a sealed iris, was somehow more alarming than any alien explanation. Dr. Daniel Jackson, who had been called in from his on-base quarters and was still carrying a coffee mug when he arrived at the control room, leaned forward over the console and watched the man in the gate room scratch the back of his head with the particular energy of someone trying to remember if they left the stove on. Jackson said, quietly, "He's not scanning the room for threats. He's not looking for exits. He's not doing anything tactical at all." Landry looked at him. Jackson looked back. "That's either the most dangerous thing I've ever seen," Jackson said, "or the strangest." Neither man had the information yet to know that those two things were, in this case, exactly the same. The containment team moved in at 4:01 hours. Standard procedure for unknown gate arrivals. Establish physical perimeter. Attempt communication. Prepare for extraction to holding. It was a protocol that had worked on Jaffa warriors, rogue Asgard experiments, and half a dozen other categories of threat that had arrived uninvited through the gate. Saitama watched them form up around him with mild interest, glanced at the nearest team member, and then looked back at the gate again, apparently more interested in the piece of ancient alien infrastructure than in the 12 armed soldiers currently attempting to establish a containment perimeter around him. Colonel Samantha Carter arrived at the control room at 4:04, took one look at the sensor readouts on the console, and immediately asked the technician to run the scan again, because the initial biometric data on the individual in the gate room was producing numbers that the system kept flagging as instrument error. The man's physical readings were returning values that the system simply had no classification for, not elevated in the way that Jaffa symbiotes elevated certain readings, not modified in the way that Asgard genetic engineering produced modifications, just fundamentally outside the range of parameters the equipment had been designed to measure. Carter watched the scan run a third time and get the same results, and she said nothing for a long moment because she was a scientist and scientists don't say things out loud until they have more than 3 data points. But the expression on her face was the specific expression she reserved for problems that were going to require her to rebuild her assumptions from the ground up. At 4:07, Saitama yawned. The holding room that Stargate Command used for unknown gate arrivals was not a comfortable space, and it wasn't designed to be. It was a reinforced cell 3 levels below the main gate room, with walls rated to withstand staff weapon fire and an atmosphere filtration system capable of neutralizing most known chemical and biological agents in under 4 minutes. It had successfully contained a Goa'uld-possessed NID operative, 2 instances of alien-engineered viruses, and 1 situation involving a rogue prior of the Ori that the SGC's official records still classified above top secret. It was, by any reasonable military standard, a very serious room. Saitama sat in the middle of it on a metal chair and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man waiting for a delayed train, and the ceiling, to its credit, remained structurally intact, which was more than could be said for the chair, which had developed a slight lean in its left rear leg from the moment he sat down. General Landry watched through the one-way observation panel while Dr. Jackson ran the first formal interview, which was the standard protocol for situations where the unknown arrival appeared to be at least partially communicative. Jackson was good at this. He had talked his way through conversations with system lords, ancients, and beings that existed partially outside linear time, and his method was always the same: find the point of genuine curiosity, follow it, and let the subject lead you somewhere useful. He sat across from Saitama with a recorder running and a legal pad he wasn't actually going to write on, and he started with the simplest possible question, which was where Saitama had come from. Saitama thought about this for a moment in the way someone thinks about a question they haven't considered particularly important. He said he wasn't sure exactly, that he'd gone through a round door that showed up near his apartment, and that he'd assumed it would take him somewhere interesting, because he'd been pretty bored lately and interesting things had a habit of finding him. Jackson wrote nothing on the legal pad and kept his expression neutral, which was a skill he had developed over years of practice, because the alternative, letting his face show that this answer had raised approximately 40 new questions for everyone it answered, would not have been professionally appropriate. He asked Saitama what kind of interesting things tended to find him. Saitama shrugged with one shoulder and said, "Mostly monsters." Jackson wrote one word on the legal pad. He underlined it twice. In the adjacent lab, Carter had been running analysis on the biometric data for 2 hours and had moved from confused to frustrated to something that she would later describe to Teal'c, in a rare moment of candor, as philosophically unsettled. The problem wasn't that the readings were abnormal. Abnormal readings were Tuesday in Stargate Command. The problem was that the readings were consistent. Every scan, every instrument, every methodology she applied returned the same result, which was that the physical parameters of the man in the holding room exceeded the measurement ceiling of every piece of technology she had available, not by a small margin that could be attributed to calibration drift or sensor interference, but by a margin so large that the instruments were essentially returning the equivalent of a shrug. It was like trying to measure the weight of a mountain with a kitchen scale, not because the scale was broken, but because the scale was doing exactly what it was designed to do, and what it was designed to do simply didn't apply here. She requisitioned the Asgard scanning array that had been integrated into the base systems following the legacy download, which was, by a significant margin, the most sophisticated diagnostic technology that humanity had ever had access to. The Asgard had used this technology to catalog species across multiple galaxies, to detect symbiote presence at the cellular level, to map the genetic drift of populations across thousands of years. Carter ran the full diagnostic suite on Saitama and waited for the results with the specific kind of controlled anticipation she reserved for experiments she was genuinely uncertain about. The array returned its results in 11 seconds. The results indicated that the subject was a baseline human male in his mid to late 20s, in excellent physical health, with no symbiote presence, no detectable nanite integration, no ancient gene expression, no evidence of Ori prior conversion, and no measurable source of energy output beyond normal metabolic function. Every single one of those readings was, Carter knew, completely accurate. They were also, taken together, completely impossible, because she had watched this man walk through a sealed titanium iris, and baseline human males in their mid to late 20s could not do that. She stared at the results for a long time. Then she pulled up the seismic data from the moment Saitama had knocked on the gate and ran a reverse calculation to determine what physical force would be required to produce that seismic signature. The number the calculation returned was large enough that she checked it 3 times before accepting it, and then she sat very still for a moment before picking up her radio and asking General Landry if she could speak with him privately before the next interview session, because she had something to tell him that she wanted to say out loud to another human being before she put it in a report. Meanwhile, 3 levels up, Teal'c had volunteered to stand outside the holding room as additional security, which Landry had accepted because Teal'c's instincts about threat assessment had been reliable for over a decade. Teal'c stood in the corridor and observed Saitama through the observation panel, with an attention that was different in quality from the attention of the other personnel on the base. Teal'c had served Apophis for 80 years. He had stood in the presence of System Lords, beings that styled themselves gods and had enough power to make the claim feel credible. He had learned in that time to recognize a particular quality in the bearing of something genuinely dangerous, a stillness that was not peace but potential, a relaxation that was not weakness but the complete absence of the need to appear strong. He watched Saitama look at the ceiling and drum his fingers once on the metal table and then stop, apparently having lost interest in even that minor activity, and Teal'c's expression, which was already not an expressive face, became very still indeed. He did not radio his assessment to Landry immediately, because Teal'c was precise about language and he wanted to find the right words. What he eventually transmitted, in the clipped shorthand of base communication, was 4 words: "Do not provoke him." Landry, reading the message in the control room, looked at it for a long moment and then looked at the live feed from the holding room, where Saitama had found a small crack in the ceiling tile and was staring at it with the detached interest of a man with nothing better to do. Landry keyed his radio and asked Teal'c what his read on the threat level was. There was a pause of several seconds before Teal'c responded, which was unusual because Teal'c was not a man who paused. His response was, "Unknown." And that is the problem. The report that Carter submitted to General Landry at 900 hours was 11 pages long, single-spaced, and classified at a level that didn't have an official name yet because the SGC's classification system had not previously needed a category above "eyes only," presidential clearance required. She had spent 2 hours writing it and another 40 minutes deciding how to title it before settling on preliminary assessment. Unknown anomalous individual, gate room arrival 347, which was the most neutral language she could find for a document whose core conclusion was that the man currently sitting in holding room 3 eating a protein bar with mild disappointment was, by every available measurement, physically impossible. Landry read the full report without speaking, which was his habit with reports that required his complete attention, and when he finished, he set it down on his desk and looked out the window at the mountain rock for a long moment before asking Carter, simply, "What do we do with him?" Carter had anticipated this question and did not have a good answer, which she said directly, because Carter's relationship with uncertainty was honest, and she had learned years ago that pretending to have answers she didn't have in front of Landry wasted everyone's time. What she had instead was a list of things they couldn't do. They couldn't contain him, because the holding room was rated to standards that his passive presence had already technically exceeded. The chair leg, the seismic reading from the knock, the fact of the iris, and any active containment attempt would require escalating to measures that she was not comfortable escalating to, given that the subject had displayed no hostility whatsoever. They couldn't classify him medically, because the Asgard array had returned clean human results that were inconsistent with his demonstrated capabilities, and she had no framework for reconciling those 2 data sets. They couldn't send him back through the gate, because they didn't know where he came from, and the address that had generated the incoming wormhole had not appeared in any gate address database, ancient or modern, that the SGC had access to. What they could do, Carter said carefully, was keep talking to him, because the only data source that hadn't failed them yet was the man himself. What no one at Cheyenne Mountain knew, because no one at Cheyenne Mountain had the information to know it, was that the unexpected arrival of an unknown individual through the Stargate network had already triggered a second response, one that was not originating from Earth. The Goa'uld System Lord Baal maintained a network of observation posts seeded throughout gate-accessible space, automated sensor arrays that flagged unusual gate activity and transmitted summaries to his fleet at regular intervals. The activation of an unregistered gate address and the subsequent readings from Earth's Stargate, which Baal's sensors had been quietly monitoring for years, given the persistent irritation that Stargate Command represented to his operations, had generated a priority flag that reached his primary intelligence officer within 6 hours of Saitama's arrival. The flag was not about the unregistered address, unusual as that was. It was about the secondary readings that Baal's sensors had captured during the transit itself. Readings that indicated the individual who had passed through the wormhole had interacted with the gate's matter stream in a way that had never been recorded in any Goa'uld database, not in 10,000 years of Stargate network observation. Baal reviewed the sensor summary from his ship's command deck with the particular careful attention he reserved for things that represented either opportunity or threat, and the line between those two categories, in his experience, was always thinner than it appeared. He tasked his chief scientist with a full analysis and set a course toward the Tory system at a pace that would bring him within long-range sensor range in approximately 72 hours. He did not yet know what had arrived on Earth. But he had survived 10,000 years by treating things he didn't understand as threats until proven otherwise, and the sensor data he was looking at did not look like anything he had encountered in 10,000 years. Back at Cheyenne Mountain, the second interview session with Saitama had moved into its third hour, and Jackson was developing a specific kind of headache that he associated with conversations that were structurally coherent but contextually baffling. Saitama was not evasive. He was not strategic. He answered every question Jackson asked with what appeared to be complete honesty and total indifference to the implications of his answers, and the picture that was assembling itself from those answers was one that Jackson's academic and archaeological training had no shelf for. Saitama had described, in the casual tone of someone recounting their commute, defeating a creature the size of a small continent, punching a meteor, and once destroying a planet-sized weapon in a single strike. He had described these events with the same energy and emphasis he used to describe being unable to find a good deal on crab legs at the supermarket, which was a comparison he made himself, unprompted, and which Jackson had written down verbatim because he couldn't not. The part that was making Jackson's headache worse was that nothing in Saitama's account suggested he was lying, performing, or exaggerating for effect. There was no pride in the recounting, no dramatic inflation, no awareness that the things he was describing were extraordinary. He described defeating godlike opponents the way most people describe parallel parking, as something mildly tedious that needed doing and then was done. Jackson had interviewed beings who claimed divine power before, and they all had one thing in common. They knew they were impressive and they wanted you to know it too. Saitama did not appear to know he was impressive. He appeared to find the whole subject slightly boring, and that, Jackson realized with a slow, settling kind of dread, was perhaps the most alarming thing about him, because it meant that the things he was describing had not been challenges. They had been errands. Landry made 2 phone calls after reading Carter's report. The first was to the President's Chief of Staff, which was the standard escalation pathway for gate-related incidents above a certain threat threshold. The second was to the NID liaison officer, which was not standard protocol, but which Landry initiated because he had learned over the years that the NID had a habit of finding out about unusual gate arrivals through their own channels anyway, and he preferred to control the flow of that information rather than react to it. Both calls were short. Both calls left the person on the other end asking questions that Landry could not answer. By 1400 hours, Saitama had been officially classified as a Priority 1 Unknown, a designation that had been used exactly twice before in SGC history, and both previous uses had involved threats that had required the full military and scientific resources of the base to address. The difference, Carter noted privately, was that both previous Priority 1 Unknowns had been actively trying to do something. Saitama appeared to be waiting for lunch. The decision to move Saitama to an above-ground facility was not made lightly, and the reasoning behind it was more complicated than it appeared in the official transfer documentation. Carter had raised the structural concern in her morning briefing, not dramatically, but with the quiet precision she used when she was saying something that sounded extreme but was technically correct, which was that the continued presence of an individual whose passive physical interactions were producing seismic readings in a deep underground military installation was a facility's risk that compounded with time. The holding room chair had not been the only casualty. Overnight monitoring had detected microfractures developing in the reinforced wall panel nearest to where Saitama had leaned back at one point during the second interview, not from any deliberate action, but apparently from the incidental pressure of a relaxed posture against a wall rated for staff weapon impact. Landry had looked at the structural report and then looked at Carter and asked, with the weariness of a man who had stopped being surprised but had not stopped being tired, whether she was telling him that the man was damaging the building by sitting in it. Carter had said, essentially, yes. The above-ground site they transferred him to was a secured research annex 40 minutes from the mountain, a facility that was officially listed in government records as an atmospheric monitoring station, and which had been used previously for sensitive material analysis that required distance from the SGC's main infrastructure. It had more space, less critical infrastructure in the surrounding walls, and this was Carter's actual primary motivation: more room to run external sensor arrays without the mountain's rock mass interfering with readings. She wanted a cleaner data environment. She wanted to know if any of Saitama's readings changed when he was relaxed, mobile, and not in an enclosed space. The answer, which she obtained within the first 2 hours of the transfer, was no. The readings were identical. Whatever was happening with his physical parameters was not a function of environment or stress state. It was simply what he was. Saitama, for his part, seemed genuinely more comfortable at the annex, primarily because there was a window. He stood at the window for the first 40 minutes after arrival and looked at the Colorado landscape with the mild appreciation of someone who had been indoors for longer than was ideal and was glad to see sky again. He asked at one point whether there was a convenience store nearby, which the security officer stationed outside the door relayed to his supervisor with the specific uncertain tone of someone who had not been briefed on how to handle logistical requests from Priority 1 unknowns. The request was eventually escalated to Landry, who authorized the procurement of a selection of snack items from a nearby gas station, because the alternative, explaining to this individual that they couldn't accommodate a minor request, seemed like an unnecessary source of friction given everything else currently on the table. It was during this window-watching period that the first external complication arrived, and it arrived in the form of a phone call to Landry from the NID that was significantly less cooperative in tone than the initial notification call had been. The NID had obtained secondary information about the gate arrival through a source that Landry's office was still attempting to identify, and the NID's position, conveyed through their liaison with a smoothness that didn't quite conceal the pressure behind it, was that an unknown individual of potentially unlimited physical capability was a national security asset that fell within their operational mandate, and that the SGC's current approach of conducting interviews and buying gas station snacks was not an appropriate response to that asset's presence. Landry said several things in response to this, some of which were professional and some of which were not, and the call ended with an agreement that both parties characterized as temporary and neither party believed would hold. What changed the dynamic of the afternoon entirely was not the NID call, and it was not Carter's sensor arrays, and it was not anything that happened inside the annex facility. It was Saitama, standing at the window, suddenly straightening up slightly, not alertly, not defensively, but with the casual shift of someone who has noticed something worth noticing, and saying to no one in particular, "There's something up there." The security officer in the room looked up. The sensor technician at the portable array looked up, Neither of them saw anything. The sky above the facility was clear and blue and empty. Saitama tilted his head slightly and said, with the tone of mild academic observation, "Big ship. It's been there for a few minutes." He paused, appeared to calculate something in his head with no particular urgency, and added, "Cloaked, probably. The air moves different around it." Carter was in the room within 3 minutes, running atmospheric sensor diagnostics that she hadn't been running because she hadn't had a reason to run them, because there were no flagged contacts in Earth's orbital space, and the planet's early warning systems had not registered any incoming vessels. It took her 9 minutes to recalibrate the array and another 4 to confirm what she was finding. And what she was finding was a localized atmospheric disturbance in the stratosphere above their position, consistent with the displacement field generated by a cloaked Goa'uld ship, a vessel large enough to classify as a mid-range HATAC, sitting stationary at 40 kilometers altitude and pointing its sensor arrays directly at the annex facility. It had not been there when they arrived. It had arrived silently, cloaked, and positioned itself directly above them within hours of Saitama's transfer to the above-ground location, which meant it had known about the transfer, which meant the intelligence breach was older and deeper than anyone had assumed. Landry's voice on the radio was controlled and precise, the voice of someone performing calm over a substrate of significant alarm, and his first question was whether they could confirm whose ship it was. Carter's answer took 30 seconds of cross-referencing energy signature data before she said, flatly, "Baal." The room went very quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when a name is said that everyone in the room recognizes as serious. Baal was not the most powerful remaining system lord, but he was widely considered the most dangerous, partly because of his resources and partly because of his patience, and partly because he had a habit of understanding situations faster than his opponents expected. He had come to Earth orbit within 72 hours of Saitama's arrival, which meant he had identified the anomaly, assessed it as worth his personal attention, and moved on it faster than any previous Goa'uld response to an Earth-based development. Saitama, who had been listening to the radio exchange with mild interest, looked at Carter and asked what a Baal was. Carter started to explain the concept of Goa'uld System Lords, the parasite species, the millennia of galactic control, the ships and armies, and the genuine threat that a single system lord represented to Earth's continued existence. And she got about 3 sentences in before she noticed that Saitama's expression had moved from mild interest to the specific look of a man trying to be polite while not particularly caring about the answer. He said, "So, like a bad guy with a big ship." Carter stopped and said, "Yes, essentially." Saitama nodded and looked back at the window and said, "Okay." And that was all, and the single syllable of that response contained, somehow, a complete absence of concern that was more unsettling to everyone in the room than any aggressive reaction would have been. Baal did not decloak his ship immediately, because Baal did not do anything immediately if he could avoid it. Patience was the quality he valued most in himself and respected least in others, and the 72 hours he had spent moving his HATAC into position above the Tory research annex had been spent productively, running every sensor array at his disposal across the small, unremarkable building below, while his intelligence officer assembled everything the Goa'uld network had ever gathered on Stargate Command's operations, personnel, and known contacts. What he had assembled was thorough, current, and ultimately insufficient, because the central subject of his interest, the individual whose transit through the gate had triggered his sensors, was returning readings from his ship's array that matched Carter's experience precisely, which was that the individual appeared to be a completely normal human being who was somehow not a completely normal human being in any way that mattered. Baal found this genuinely interesting. He found very few things genuinely interesting anymore, which was one of the costs of 10,000 years of existence, and genuine interest was something he followed with care. His initial approach was not military, because military force against an unknown quantity of potentially significant capability was wasteful before you understood what you were dealing with. His initial approach was communication, which was also, conveniently, an opportunity to demonstrate his awareness of the situation and the SGC's inability to detect his presence until the unknown individual had pointed it out, both of which were useful pieces of leverage. He transmitted on the standard Stargate Command emergency frequency at 1600 hours, using their own encryption protocols, which he had obtained through means that Landry's security team was going to spend the next week being furious about. And his message was directed specifically to General Landry and was brief, elegant, and designed to establish the terms of a conversation on his preferred ground. He said that he was aware of the arrival. He said he was aware that Stargate Command did not yet understand what had arrived. He said he had information that might be mutually useful. He said he was willing to share that information under appropriate terms. He said, at the end, with the particular smoothness of someone who wanted the point to land cleanly, that he was currently positioned at 40 kilometers altitude and had been for several hours, and that the fact of his undetected presence should be considered context for the conversation he was proposing. Landry's response to this transmission, delivered in the SGC Situation Room with Carter, Jackson, Teal'c, and Colonel Mitchell present, was to close his eyes for approximately 3 seconds and then open them, and ask Mitchell to get SG-1 geared up, because if Baal was making direct contact, it meant the situation had moved from an internal classification problem to an active external threat. And active external threats were SG-1's professional category. Mitchell asked the obvious question, which was what they were going to do about the man at the annex, and Landry said they were going to bring him to the mountain, because having Baal in orbit and Saitama in a separate facility with reduced security and a structural concern was a combination of variables he wasn't comfortable managing remotely. Jackson pointed out carefully that moving Saitama required Saitama's agreement, because nothing in the past 48 hours had suggested that physical compulsion was a realistic option. Landry looked at Jackson and said that Jackson was going to go ask him nicely, which was a sentence that had never before been said in the SGC Situation Room in reference to a priority one unknown, but which everyone present recognized as the correct call. Jackson drove to the annex personally. He sat down across from Saitama, who was eating from a bag of chips that the gas station run had provided, and explained the situation with the directness that Saitama seemed to respond to better than the careful institutional language that the security briefings had been using. He said there was an alien warlord in a spaceship above them who wanted to talk about Saitama, and that the safest place to manage that conversation from was the mountain base, and would Saitama be willing to come back. Saitama finished a chip and thought about this for a moment. He asked if the alien warlord was the kind of alien warlord who would eventually try to start a fight. Jackson said, with professional honesty, almost certainly. Saitama said okay, and stood up and put the chips in his pocket for the road, and that was the entirety of the negotiation. The return to Cheyenne Mountain took 40 minutes, and Baal decloaked his ship during the drive, which was a decision timed with theatrical precision that Landry recognized immediately as a message. Not a threat, not yet, but a demonstration that Baal was controlling the packing of events. The haddock hung in the Colorado sky like a massive, ugly fact, visible to every person in a 50-mile radius who happened to look up, and within 20 minutes of the decloak, Landry's office was receiving calls from NORAD, the Air Force, the Pentagon, and the White House in that order, all of which he handled with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been explaining Stargate-related situations to government officials for years, and none of which he was able to fully satisfy because the honest answer to, "What is that, and what do you need?" was, "We don't completely know yet, and we'll tell you when we do." Baal's second transmission came at 1800 hours, 2 hours after the decloak, and its tone had shifted in a way that Landry's team recognized as deliberate de-escalation, which with Baal meant he wanted something specific and was preparing the conversational ground to ask for it. He said he had no hostile intentions toward Earth at this time, which was a qualifier that everyone in the room noted. He said the individual who had arrived through the Stargate represented an unknown variable that affected not only Tory interests but broader galactic stability, which was Baal's way of establishing shared concern without conceding any position. He said he was willing to descend to the surface for a direct conversation, under standard terms of non-aggression, because some discussions were better conducted in person. It was, Jackson noted quietly, an unusually transparent play from someone who normally operated through layers of intermediary and plausible deniability. Baal wanted to see Saitama directly. He was being uncharacteristically straightforward about it, which meant he was either very confident or very cautious, and with Baal those two states were often the same thing. Saitama, sitting in the SGC briefing room eating the remainder of his chips, while the transmission played on the overhead monitor, watched Baal's holographic representative deliver the message with the politely attentive expression of someone watching a television program they haven't decided whether they like yet. When the transmission ended, he asked if the alien warlord talked like that all the time, and Mitchell, who was sitting across from him, said unfortunately yes. Saitama nodded and said the guy seemed like a lot of work. Baal materialized in the SGC's main briefing room at 900 hours the following morning via ring transporter, which was a deliberate choice of arrival method that communicated several things simultaneously. That he had a ship close enough to use rings rather than a Teltac shuttle, that he was confident enough in the terms of the meeting to arrive without a visible armed escort, and that he wanted the entrance to carry a certain weight. The ring platform activated with the deep resonant sound that always made the floor vibrate slightly, and Baal stepped out of the dissipating energy with the particular physical composure of someone who had been making entrances for 10 millennia and had refined the art to something close to instinct. He was wearing his standard dark formal attire, unhurried, his eyes moving across the room with the practiced efficiency of a being who assessed every space he entered as both an opportunity and a potential threat. He took in Landry, Carter, Jackson, Teal'c, and Mitchell in a single sweep that assigned each of them a category and a weight. Then his gaze moved to the end of the table where Saitama was sitting, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second, brief enough that only Carter caught it because she was watching specifically for it, something shifted in Baal's expression that was not quite hesitation, but was the thing that lived next to hesitation. Saitama was looking at Baal with the mild curiosity he applied to most new things, the expression of someone who finds something moderately worth looking at. He was still in his white jumpsuit. There was a small snack wrapper on the table in front of him that no one had removed because no one had wanted to make a thing of it. He did not stand. He did not adjust his posture. He looked at Baal the way you look at someone who has just walked into a waiting room you've been sitting in for a while, and the complete absence of any response that Baal's entrance was designed to produce. Awe, wariness, political calculation, fear, appeared to register on Baal's face as something he needed a moment to process. He recovered smoothly, because Baal always recovered smoothly, and he took his seat at the opposite end of the table with the ease of someone settling into a chair they have decided belongs to them, and he began to speak. His opening was directed at Landry and framed as a strategic briefing. He had sensor data from his network. He had analysis from his science division. He had conclusions that the SGC's own assessment had not yet reached, and he was prepared to share these things in the interest of a situation that he characterized, with the precision of someone choosing every word, as genuinely unprecedented. He said the gate address that had generated Saitama's incoming wormhole did not correspond to any planet in the Milky Way or Pegasus gate networks. He said his sensors had tracked the wormhole's origin vector, and it pointed toward a region of space that his navigation systems had no data for. He said the individual who had come through that gate was not registering on any Goa'uld biological classification system, not as human, not as Jaffa, not as any known or cataloged species. He said this in the measured, controlled tone of someone presenting intelligence, but underneath the tone was something that Teal'c, who had served this man's kind for 80 years and knew how they sounded when they were genuinely uncertain, identified as something he had never heard from a system lord before. Baal was not certain what he was looking at. And Baal being uncertain was, in Teal'c's experience, approximately as alarming as Baal being confident, because at least when Baal was confident, you knew what he was going to do. Saitama listened to the entire opening statement with his chin resting on one hand and the expression of someone attending a meeting they were told was mandatory. When Baal finished, there was a brief silence, and then Saitama said, "So you came all the way here just to say you don't know what I am either?" Baal looked at him for a moment. He said, carefully, that he had come to conduct an assessment and to propose terms for managing an unstable variable. Saitama said, which was not an agreement or a disagreement, but simply the sound of a man receiving information and filing it in the folder labeled not particularly relevant. Baal's jaw tightened by approximately 2 millimeters, which Carter noted, and which Mitchell would later describe as the most satisfying thing he had witnessed in the briefing room in 5 years. What Baal proposed, over the following 40 minutes, was a joint research arrangement. SGC resources combined with Goa'uld sensor technology pointed at the problem of identifying Saitama's origin and capability profile, with the understanding that the data produced would be shared equally, and that neither party would take unilateral action regarding the subject without mutual consultation. It was a reasonable proposal from a purely strategic standpoint, and everyone in the room knew it was also a trap of some kind, because Baal's proposals were always traps of some kind. The question was just identifying which layer the trap was operating on. Jackson thought it was an intelligence-gathering exercise. Carter thought it was a technology transfer play. Teal'c thought it was both, and that there was a third layer they hadn't identified yet. Landry was inclined to decline on principle, but recognized that Baal's sensor data was probably genuinely useful, and that useful information was useful information regardless of the source. The meeting might have continued in this vein of careful, layered diplomatic maneuvering for some time, except that Saitama, who had been sitting quietly, pushed his chair back from the table, stood up and walked to the window overlooking the gate room below. Everyone watched him. He stood there for a moment looking down at the gate, and then he turned around and looked at Baal and said, with complete conversational casualness, "You want to fight me?" It was not a question. Baal's expression went through several things very quickly and settled on something that was not quite denial. Saitama continued in the same tone, "That's what all of this is. You want to see what I am and you think fighting is the best way to find out." He paused. "I get that a lot." He looked at Baal with the specific resignation of someone who has had this conversation before and knows how it ends, and is not particularly looking forward to going through it again. And Baal, for the first time in a meeting that he had prepared for extensively, had absolutely no prepared response. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Baal said quietly, and with a precision that made the words land differently than his previous careful diplomatic language, "What are you?" And Saitama thought about this for a moment, genuinely and without performance, and then said, "A hero. For fun." And then he sat back down and looked at the snack wrapper on the table and appeared to consider whether he wanted another bag of chips. The decision Baal made was not impulsive. That was the part that everyone who reviewed the security footage afterward struggled with, because impulsive decisions were understandable, and what Baal did was not impulsive. He had sat with Saitama's answer for 17 minutes. The security timestamp confirmed this, continuing the formal meeting discussion with Landry about joint research parameters, asking technical questions through Carter about the Asgard scanning results, maintaining every surface appearance of a productive diplomatic session. He was processing. Baal was always processing, running calculations beneath every conversation, weighing variables, projecting outcomes, and what he had been doing for those 17 minutes was constructing the most complete picture he could of what sat at the other end of the table and deciding, with the methodical patience of 10,000 years of survival, what to do about it. The conclusion he reached was not that Saitama was safe to ignore. The conclusion was that the only remaining data point that mattered, the one that all his sensor arrays and intelligence networks, and 17 minutes of careful observation had failed to produce, was what Saitama actually did when something hit him. He moved without announcement, without escalation, without any of the theatrical warning that system lords typically employed to maximize psychological impact. He raised his hand device, the ribbon device integrated into his palm that was capable of generating a focused energy burst sufficient to rupture internal organs at range, and he fired it at Saitama from across the briefing table. The discharge hit Saitama in the chest at full power. The energy bloom was significant enough to blow out the overhead lighting on that side of the room and blow the chair behind Saitama backward into the wall hard enough to crack the reinforced paneling. Carter dove left. Mitchell went for his sidearm. Teal'c was already moving. Landry did not move, not because he was calm, but because the result of the discharge was so immediate and so total in its wrongness that his body simply did not have a prepared response for what it was seeing. Saitama looked down at his chest. There was a scorch mark on his jumpsuit the size of a dinner plate, and it was smoking slightly, and he looked at it with the expression of a man who has just spilled something on a shirt he was reasonably fond of. He touched the scorch mark with 2 fingers. He looked up at Baal. His expression was not angry. It was the specific expression of mild, weary recognition. The expression of someone who had been hoping, on some level, that this particular thing wouldn't happen, because it meant the next 10 minutes were going to be tedious in a way he had been through enough times to find genuinely tiresome. Baal, for his part, was standing completely still on the other side of the table with his hand device still raised, and his expression doing something that it had probably not done in several centuries, which was broadcasting, clearly and without concealment, that the result of his action had not been what he expected. Mitchell had his sidearm up and was covering Baal. Teal'c had his staff weapon leveled. Carter was pulling Landry toward the door, and Saitama pushed his chair back from the table and stood up with the unhurried movement of someone excusing themselves to use the bathroom during a meeting, and said to Baal, in a tone of mild, earnest regret, "You really didn't have to do that." Baal fired the ribbon device again, this time at maximum output, and the energy discharge was powerful enough that the wall behind Saitama didn't just crack. It fractured in a pattern that Carter would later calculate required a force equivalent to a focused plasma burst several orders of magnitude beyond standard ribbon device output, which meant Baal had pushed the device to a level that technically exceeded its rated specifications, which meant he had been genuinely trying. The scorch mark on Saitama's jumpsuit got slightly larger. Saitama looked at Baal with the particular disappointment of someone who had extended a reasonable social expectation and had it ignored. What happened next took approximately 1.4 seconds from initiation to conclusion, which was the duration captured on the security footage, and which became one of the most analyzed pieces of video in the SGC's classified archive. Saitama did not charge. He did not wind up. He took one step forward and tapped Baal in the chest with 2 fingers in what appeared, from a purely visual standpoint, to be a light, almost gentle push. The result was not light and was not gentle. Baal traveled backward from the point of contact through the briefing room wall, through the corridor behind it, through the secondary wall beyond the corridor, and came to rest against the mountainside bedrock at the far end of the resulting channel of destroyed infrastructure, with the stillness of something that had been turned off. The distance traveled was later measured at 31 feet through solid reinforced construction. The structural damage to the SGC's B-level corridor section was assessed at a cost that the base commander's damage report declined to estimate with precision, listing it instead as significant and non-trivial. Saitama stood in the hole where the briefing room wall had been, looked at the distant, crumpled shape of Baal at the end of the corridor, and sighed quietly. He turned back to where Mitchell, Teal'c, Carter, and Landry were all frozen in various postures of having been about to do something that was now clearly unnecessary, and he said, "He's not dead. Those guys never die." He picked up the snack wrapper from the table, which had somehow survived the entire sequence intact, and folded it once and put it in his pocket. Then he looked at the hole in the wall and the wrecked corridor beyond it, and he said, to no one in particular, "Sorry about the wall." And then he sat down again, in a chair that was not his original chair because that was somewhere behind him, and he looked at the ceiling with the bottomless patience of a man waiting for the next thing to happen, whatever it was going to be. Baal at the far end of the corridor stirred after 40 seconds. Goa'uld symbiotes could repair catastrophic physical damage, and Baal's symbiote was old and strong and had kept him alive through worse, technically, though nothing quite like this, and it began working immediately. He raised his head from the rubble. His expression, visible on the secondary corridor camera, was not the expression of a humiliated man or a defeated man. It was the expression of a scientist who has just run an experiment and received a result that significantly upgrades their assessment of the problem. He lay in the rubble for another 30 seconds, and then he said, to no one who could hear him, in a voice that was very quiet and very precise, "I see." Which was not a concession and was not a retreat. It was the sound of Baal updating his model, and an updated Baal was, in every historical instance, more dangerous than an uninformed one. Baal left the SGC under his own power, which was itself a statement, because of being capable of leaving under his own power after what had just happened to him was making a point about what under his own power meant for someone with a Goa'uld symbiote running accelerated cellular repair at full capacity. He walked back through the corridor he had been sent through, which the SGC's engineering team was already assessing for immediate structural stabilization, and he walked through the briefing room without speaking to anyone, and he activated his personal ring transporter and dematerialized with the same composed entrance-level control he had arrived with, which was either remarkable self-possession or the specific kind of performance that conceals something much more complicated underneath. Teal'c watched him go from the corridor doorway and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say yet, and Teal'c had learned to save his words for when they would do something. The Haddock decloaked fully in low orbit within the hour, which was a shift from its previous stationary position, and which Carter's sensors read as a change to a moving patrol pattern, not departing, not positioning for attack, just moving in the slow elliptical drift of a very large vessel that was staying close but not committing to a vector. It was, Jackson observed in the Situation Room briefing, the physical equivalent of Baal thinking out loud. The ship moved the way he thought, without announcing its direction until the direction was already decided. Landry asked Carter how long before the ship left Earth's orbital space entirely, and Carter said she genuinely didn't know, which was an answer that Landry received with the deep, settled tiredness of a man who had heard it too many times and was no longer surprised, but was never going to be fully comfortable with it either. What Baal was doing aboard his ship was working, and he was working with the specific focused intensity that he reserved for problems that had genuinely surprised him, which were, after 10,000 years, very few in number. His science division had been running analysis continuously since the initial sensor detection, and the briefing room encounter had now added direct physical data to the sensor profile. The energy absorption readings from the ribbon device discharge, the force vector from the two-finger contact, the structural impact data transmitted by the SGC's own building sensors, which Baal's intelligence network was pulling in real time through a tap that the SGC's security team had not yet located. He cross-referenced everything his Goa'uld database contained on anomalous physical phenomena, ancients, ascended beings, Ori manifestations, every category of entity that the 10,000-year Goa'uld knowledge base had accumulated, and the cross-reference returned nothing useful, because nothing in that database behaved the way Saitama behaved. Ascended beings were energy. Ori were power rooted through belief. Ancient enhanced humans showed measurable energy signatures. Saitama showed nothing, and yet the briefing room wall was currently 31 feet of evidence that nothing was not the right word. He began constructing a new model, because that was what Baal did when existing models failed. He didn't discard the problem, he rebuilt the framework. The new model started from the observed data and worked backward toward a hypothesis, and the hypothesis he arrived at was one that his rational mind resisted because it violated fundamental assumptions about how power worked in any physics system he understood. The hypothesis was that Saitama's physical capability was not generated by any source, not a symbiote, not technology, not an energy field, not genetic modification, not ascension, not divine channeling, but was simply intrinsic in a way that had no mechanism. That it was not a product of anything and therefore could not be addressed by targeting the source, because there was no source. That it was not a level of power that could be matched by scaling up a known force, because it did not exist on the same scale. He sat with this hypothesis for 2 hours, and then called his chief science officer in and presented it. And his chief science officer, who was an intelligent and experienced Goa'uld, who had survived Baal's service for 3 centuries by being honest when honesty was required, said that the hypothesis was consistent with all available data, and that he could not construct an alternative that fit the evidence better. Baal said quietly, "Then we don't fight it." His science officer waited. "We redirect it," Baal said, and the quality of his voice when he said it was the quality that people who had worked for him long enough recognized as the moment when he had found the angle. Not the solution. Baal was honest enough with himself to know there was no solution to what he had encountered in the briefing room. But the angle, the way to make what couldn't be controlled into something that could be aimed. Back at Cheyenne Mountain, the briefing room reconstruction had been assessed, priorities assigned, and the base had moved into the particular operational mode that Landry privately categorized as managing multiple simultaneous problems while trying to look like we have a plan. The immediate structural work was underway. The security review of the intelligence breach that had allowed Baal to know about the facility transfer was producing results that were going to make several people's careers significantly harder in the near term. And Saitama was sitting in a new briefing room. The old one was a construction site, eating a cup of instant noodles that the commissary had provided, which he had declared better than expected, which was the most positive assessment he had offered of anything at the SGC so far. Jackson sat with him while the Situation Room activity continued around them and returned to the interview methodology that had been working, which was simply having a conversation rather than conducting an interrogation. He asked Saitama about the fight, specifically about Baal, specifically whether Saitama had been holding back. Saitama said yes, immediately and without any particular pride in the answer, in the way that someone confirms a factual detail rather than making a point. Jackson asked how much. Saitama thought about it and said, "A lot." Jackson asked why. Saitama said because the guy hadn't really been trying to kill him, just testing, and it seemed rude to go full strength against someone who was still in the figuring out stage. He said he usually tried to calibrate to the situation. Jackson asked what calibration looked like when Saitama wasn't holding back, and Saitama looked at Jackson with the mild, honest expression he used for factual statements and said, "Different kind of hole in the wall." He finished his noodles and set the cup down and said, "He'll be back, though. That type always comes back with a plan." Jackson said he knew. Saitama nodded and said that was the boring part, the waiting for the plan, and he looked at the gate room through the new briefing room window with the bottomless patience of someone who had been through this enough times to know that the plan, whatever it was, wasn't going to change how it ended. In orbit, Baal's haddock completed its third elliptical pass and settled into a stable position on the sunward side of Earth, where the solar interference would make detailed scanning from the surface more difficult. He opened a communication channel, not to the SGC this time, but to a specific encrypted frequency that reached a specific set of ears scattered across several star systems. The ears of the remaining system lords who had survived the last several years of galactic restructuring, and who maintained, out of necessity more than trust, a loose network of mutual notification for developments that exceeded any single lord's ability to manage alone. His message was short. He said there was something on Earth that they all needed to know about. He said he had met it. He said it was not like anything in the database. He said he was developing an approach and would share it when it was ready, but that in the meantime no one should engage it directly without his analysis in hand. He said this last part twice, in slightly different words, which was Baal's way of saying that he was serious. And Baal being serious in a message to other system lords was an event that, historically, preceded very large and very bad things. The response to Baal's encrypted transmission came in faster than he expected, which told him something about the current state of the remaining system lords that he filed away as useful information. 3 responses within 6 hours meant 3 system lords who were either bored, anxious, or operating at a resource level that made rapid mobilization easy. And in the current galactic political climate, bored and anxious were basically the same thing. The Goa'uld Empire that had controlled the Milky Way for 10,000 years had been fracturing for decades under pressure from the Tauri, the Takra, the Free Jaffa, and simple attrition. And what remained of the System Lord Council was a reduced and wary collection of survivors who had stayed alive primarily by being cautious, and who were therefore, in Baal's assessment, exactly the wrong people to be making decisions about Saitama. Cautious people, presented with something they didn't understand, defaulted to one of 2 responses. They either ran from it or they hid it with everything they had. And Baal's message had been specifically designed to prevent the second response, which was the one that would make everything worse. The system lord who responded fastest was Camulus, which surprised no one who knew him because Camulus was perpetually looking for leverage and perpetually overestimating his ability to use it. His response asked 3 questions in rapid succession. What was the threat's energy signature? What were its known weaknesses? And what was the fastest approach vector to Earth from his current position? The third question was, in Baal's estimation, the most informative, because it meant Camulus had already decided to come regardless of the answer to the first 2, which was exactly the kind of unilateral decision Baal had asked everyone not to make. He sent Camulus a response that addressed the first 2 questions in detail and ignored the third entirely, which was a message in itself. He then rerouted his own position slightly so that his sensors would catch Camulus's approach vector when it materialized, because it was going to materialize regardless of what Baal said, and Baal preferred to know where impending mistakes were coming from. At the SGC, the intelligence team's intercept division had been running passive monitoring on known Goa'uld frequencies since Baal's ship had arrived, which was standard protocol for any confirmed system lord presence near Earth, and the traffic they were capturing in the 18 hours following the briefing room incident was significantly higher than baseline in both volume and encryption complexity. Carter brought the intercept summary to Landry at 700 and said that the traffic pattern was consistent with multi-party coordination across at least 3 confirmed system lord communication nodes, which in plain language meant that Baal had told other system lords about Saitama, and they were talking about it, and the conversation was moving fast. Landry looked at the intercept summary and then looked at the ceiling in the way he looked at it when the options available to him were all significantly worse than he would prefer. He asked Carter whether they had any decoded content. She said fragments, consistent with a threat assessment discussion and possible coordinated response planning. Landry asked what coordinated response meant in this context. Carter said, carefully, it probably meant ships. The conversation with Saitama that morning was therefore approached with some urgency, and it was Jackson who had it again, because Jackson's conversational track record with Saitama was the best on the base, which was a distinction that Jackson did not particularly want but accepted because it was true. He laid it out plainly. Multiple alien warlords were now aware of Saitama's presence, were communicating about him, and were potentially moving toward Earth. He said the SGC needed to understand what Saitama was willing to do in this situation, because the situation was escalating beyond the SGC's ability to manage it through standard channels. He said this without pressure or implication, because Saitama responded badly to being managed, and Jackson had learned that the hard way during the facility transfer discussion. Saitama listened to all of this with his chin in his hand and the look of someone receiving a weather report for a place they live. When Jackson finished, Saitama said, "So more guys with big ships are coming to look at me." Jackson said essentially yes. Saitama said, "And you want to know if I'll help?" Jackson said that was one way to put it. Saitama was quiet for a moment, not in the way of someone weighing a difficult decision, but in the way of someone trying to locate their actual feeling about something that should probably matter more to them than it does. He said, "If someone tries to hurt people here, I'll stop it." He said this not as a declaration or a commitment, but as a statement of what he considered basic and obvious, the way you'd say you'd hold a door for someone if your hands were free. He said, "I'm not going to go looking for a fight though, that's boring." And then he looked at Jackson and said, "You said ships, plural, how many?" Jackson said they weren't sure yet. Saitama nodded slowly and said, "Last time someone sent a lot of ships at me, it was still just one punch each." And he said this with the resigned arithmetic of a man calculating a chore load rather than a battle. And Jackson sat with that sentence for a long moment and found that it did not comfort him in the way it probably should have. What none of them knew yet was that Camulus had not come alone. His message to the two remaining system lords he maintained functional alliances with had gone out within hours of Baal's transmission, framed not as a consultation but as a mobilization, and the response had been faster than even Camulus expected, because the other lords were as restless and resource-pressured as Baal had assessed, and the prospect of a coordinated move on Earth, long a source of humiliation and operational loss for the system lords. Under the banner of addressing a new threat was the kind of opportunity that moved fast in a community of beings who were always looking for an excuse to consolidate position. 3 Hattacks were now in transit toward Earth's solar system, each carrying standard complement of Jaffa warriors, each commanded by a system lord who had received Baal's warning and interpreted it differently. Not as a reason to be cautious, but as a reason to arrive with enough force to be relevant. Baal's sensors detected the approach signatures at extreme range, and he looked at the incoming data with the expression of someone who has told a room full of people not to touch something, and has just heard the sound of something breaking. He opened a channel to Cheyenne Mountain on the SGC emergency frequency and said, without preamble, 3 Hattacks inbound. Estimated arrival 14 hours. Camulus is commanding the approach. I want it noted that I advised against this. Landry's response was unprintable in its first 3 words and then became professionally controlled, and he asked what Baal recommended. There was a pause of several seconds and Baal said, "Put the bald one somewhere visible." There was another pause. Landry asked what that was supposed to mean. Baal said, with the precise economy of someone who had recently revised their model significantly, "It means that whatever is going to happen when those ships arrive, the outcome will not be determined by anything your military does or anything I do. You know this. I know this. Position accordingly." He closed the channel before Landry could respond, which was a habit of his, and in the situation room the silence that followed Baal's transmission was the specific silence of people absorbing a statement they found both alarming and, on reflection, correct. Saitama, who had been given a cot in a secure observation room and had apparently been asleep for most of the previous 6 hours, appeared in the Situation Room doorway at 2200 hours in his jumpsuit, eating an apple from the commissary, and asked what all the activity was about. Mitchell told him 3 alien warships were 14 hours out. Saitama said, and took another bite of the apple and looked at the tactical display showing the inbound trajectory markers, and then he said, "I'll be outside when they get here," and went back to his cot. And the simplicity of that sentence, its complete absence of qualification or strategy or concern, sat in the Situation Room for a long time after he left, filling the space that military planning usually occupied, replacing it with something that everyone present recognized, but none of them had a professional category for, which was the specific, unsettling, almost uncomfortable feeling of not being the most important factor in a situation that was nominally yours to manage. The 3 Hattacks dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Earth's solar system at 11:47 hours, which was 3 hours ahead of Baal's estimated arrival window, meaning Camulus had pushed his fleet harder than standard transit protocols recommended, which Carter noted in her Situation Room briefing as a data point about his psychological state. Specifically, that he was eager in a way that suggested he had constructed a narrative about this situation that he was invested in. And invested narratives made for predictable behavior, and predictable behavior was the only tactical advantage the SGC currently had that was worth anything. The 3 vessels moved in a loose formation, broadcasting on an open frequency that the SGC's communication systems picked up immediately, and the broadcast was in the formal declarative register that Goa'uld System Lords used when they wanted their statements recorded as official positions rather than opening gambits. Camulus announced that he came in the name of the System Lord Council, which was technically accurate in the sense that he had told 2 other System Lords he was going, and they hadn't stopped him, and that his purpose was the assessment and containment of an anomalous threat to galactic order, and that Stargate Command was instructed to stand down from all defensive postures and permit the Council's operations to proceed without interference. Landry listened to the transmission, turned to Mitchell, and said, "Stand down from defensive postures," with the specific flat intonation of a man repeating something back to confirm that it was as absurd as he initially assessed it to be. Mitchell confirmed that it was. Landry picked up his radio and said, formally, that Stargate Command did not recognize the jurisdiction of the System Lord Council over Earth's territorial space, and that any vessel approaching within defensive engagement range would be treated as a hostile incursion, and that he strongly recommended the incoming fleet hold its current position while diplomatic channels were explored. This was the language the SGC used when it needed to sound like it had more options than it actually had, and everyone in the Situation Room knew it, and the Goa'uld certainly knew it, and the fact that it was said anyway was simply the ritual acknowledgement that the process had been followed before the process became irrelevant. Outside, Saitama was standing on the surface access road above the mountain entrance, hands in his pockets, looking up at the Colorado sky with the mild, unhurried attention he brought to most things. The morning was clear and cold, and the mountains were the particular shade of winter gray that made the sky above them look very large, and he stood in it with the quality of stillness that had nothing to do with waiting because waiting implied the outcome was uncertain. He had eaten breakfast. He had found at the commissary a surprisingly decent bowl of rice that he had commented on favorably to the serving staff, which was perhaps the most conventionally human thing anyone at the SGC had seen him do, and which had made the commissary worker deeply uncertain how to feel. He was wearing his white jumpsuit with the yellow cape, which had been laundered by the base facilities staff at his request, and the scorch mark from Baal's ribbon device had been assessed by the laundry team as permanent, which Saitama had said was fine, that it had been through worse. The first Haddock broke from the formation at 12:03 hours and descended through the atmosphere at an aggressive approach angle, not a landing vector but a weapons range vector, and its primary staff cannons came online at 12:06, which Carter's sensor array detected and immediately broadcast to Landry's situation room. The bombardment began at 12:08, targeted not at the mountain but at the surface access road above it, which was Camulus's tactical choice to isolate the anomalous individual from the facility before attempting analysis, which was a strategically sensible decision, and also, as it turned out, completely irrelevant to the outcome. The staff cannon impacts were significant. They would have leveled a city block. They turned the access road around Saitama into a crater landscape in approximately 90 seconds of sustained fire, each impact throwing rock and soil, and concussive force in expanding rings that the SGC's surface sensors tracked as a continuous seismic event. When the firing stopped, Saitama was standing in the middle of the crater field, his cape slightly displaced by the last impact's shockwave, examining a scorch mark on his right sleeve with the mild displeasure of someone who has twice now had their laundry outcomes affected by energy weapons and is beginning to find it irritating. He looked up at the Hatak, which was holding at 800 meters altitude with its cannons still trained on his position, and his expression cycled through the familiar sequence: mild recognition, brief consideration, resigned acceptance, and then he bent his knees slightly and jumped. The jump took him from the surface to 800 meters in a time that Carter's sensors recorded as 1.3 seconds, which required an initial launch velocity that her calculator returned a result for, and then which she stared at for several seconds before putting the calculator down. He hit the Hatak's lower hull with his fist, and the ship moved. Not exploded, moved, laterally, as a single unit, pushed sideways through the air by the force of the impact the way you push a toy across a table. It traveled approximately 400 meters horizontally before its compensators caught the momentum, and it stabilized, listing 7 degrees to port, its lower hull showing a compression deformation that the structural analysis would later describe as consistent with an impact force that the ship's engineers had not designed for because the design specifications assumed the threat model was other ships, not a single individual standing on a road. Camulus, on the command deck of the second Hatak, watched this on his visual sensors and said nothing for 11 seconds. His tactical officer offered a threat assessment. Camulus waved it aside, not because he disagreed, but because he needed the 11 seconds to complete the recalibration that Baal had already done, and that Camulus, having ignored Baal's advice, was now doing under significantly less comfortable conditions. The second Hatak fired its full complement of staff cannons at Saitama simultaneously, which was the maximum output that a single Hatak could produce, and which had, in the long history of Goa'uld military operations, destroyed everything it had ever been directed at. Saitama stood in the air at 800 meters and let the barrage hit him, and then punched the second Hatak once, and the second Hatak's forward section accordioned inward in a way that its structural integrity fields did not prevent, because structural integrity fields were rated for other ships, not for whatever force category Saitama occupied. The third Hatak, commanded by a system lord named Kali who had come because Camulus had told her there was a threat worth seeing, and who was beginning to revise her assessment of what worth seeing meant, held its position at 1,500 meters and did not fire, and this was the correct decision, though it was made not from tactical wisdom, but from the simple observation that firing had not helped either of the other two ships, and Kali was, whatever else she was, not stupid. She watched Saitama land back on the surface access road and brush something off his cape and look up at her ship with the flat, assessing squint of a man deciding whether another trip-up was necessary. She opened a communication channel to the surface, not to the SGC, directly to Saitama, and said, with the pragmatic precision of someone updating their position in real time, "I'm not here to fight you." Saitama looked at the sky for a moment. He said, "Okay." She said, "I would like to understand what you are." He said, "People keep saying that." She said, "Does it have an answer yet?" He thought about it and said, "Not really." There was a pause and Kali said, That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 400 years. And she meant it, and the transmission ended, and her haddock held its position, and it was the only ship in Earth's orbital space that was still structurally intact, which was a form of data that Kali found instructive. The two damaged haddocks withdrew from Earth's orbital space within 6 hours of the surface engagement, which was the fastest voluntary Goa'uld retreat from a Tory operation in the history of Stargate Command. And it happened not because anyone ordered it or negotiated it, but simply because both ships were structurally compromised to a degree that made continued orbital presence a liability rather than a position. Camulus's ship was listing badly and had lost 2 of its primary propulsion nodes, and the engineering assessment his Jaffa crew delivered was that sustained orbital flight was possible, but hyperspace transit was not until repairs were completed, which meant Camulus was stuck in the solar system for approximately 72 hours while his crew worked, which was 72 hours of sitting in Earth's orbital space in a damaged ship, while Saitama stood on a road below him and occasionally looked up. He spent most of those 72 hours in his command chair not speaking to anyone, and the quality of his silence was the quality of a man who had made a decision with total confidence, and was now conducting a private and thorough autopsy of that confidence, and finding the structural failures instructive and humiliating in equal measure. The data from the engagement transmitted across Baal's intelligence network within hours of the event, because Baal's sensor arrays had recorded everything, and Baal had made the decision, with characteristic calculation, to share the recording widely rather than hold it as exclusive intelligence. His reasoning was straightforward. The recording was going to be obtained by other parties regardless, through their own sensor networks or through Camulus's inevitable debrief, and the party that controlled the distribution of paradigm-shifting information controlled the narrative around it. So Baal distributed it himself, with a brief analytical summary attached that said, in essence, that this was what had happened, that his own direct engagement data was consistent with what the recording showed, and that the appropriate response to this information was a fundamental revision of tactical assumptions rather than an escalation of force. He said this last part knowing that some of the recipients would ignore it, because that was what some of them always did, and knowing that the ones who ignored it would be providing him with additional data points about what happened when people ignored it, which was its own form of useful information. At the SGC, Landry was conducting the most complicated morning briefing of his tenure as base commander, which was a high bar given his tenure's competition. The situation had moved in 12 hours from a single unknown gate arrival to 2 disabled Goa'uld warships in Earth's solar system. One intact Goa'uld warship maintaining a non-hostile position, Baal's haddock in a separate orbital position conducting what appeared to be intensive sensor analysis. The public visibility of a haddock engagement in Earth's atmosphere that had been observed by enough people in enough locations to make information containment, a problem that the government's cover story infrastructure was not designed to address at this scale. And at the center of all of it, Saitama, sitting in the commissary eating a second bowl of the rice he had identified as good and reading a manga that someone on the base had lent him, apparently unaffected by the morning's events in any way that he considered worth discussing. The public visibility problem was the one Landry was least equipped to manage, because it was operating on a scale and a medium that the SGC's standard containment protocols had been built for an earlier era of communication. The engagement had happened in daylight over Colorado, and the combination of 2 military-grade alien spacecraft and visible impact events from the surface had generated video documentation distributed across multiple platforms within minutes of the first cannon fire. And by the time the SGC's liaison with the Information Containment Division had been fully briefed and activated, the footage was already jurisdictionally uncontainable. The cover narrative options that were quickly assembled and assessed were all inadequate in different ways. Experimental military exercise didn't account for the ship designs. Weather phenomenon didn't account for the structured impact patterns. Classified aerospace tests didn't scale to the visibility window. And what Landry's team eventually arrived at was not a cover story, but a decision about what to confirm and what to leave ambiguous, which was a category of public communication the SGC had been avoiding for its entire operational history. What the footage showed, to anyone watching it carefully, was a single individual on the surface surviving the full staff cannon output of one hatak, jumping to ship altitude under his own power, and deflecting two ships from active hostile engagement with what appeared to be unarmed physical force. The individual was visible in the footage but not clearly identifiable at the resolution most cameras had captured him at, which gave the SGC a narrow window to control his specific identification, even if the event itself was uncontainable. Landry made the decision to not pursue aggressive identification suppression, which was the opposite of standard protocol, and his reasoning, which he laid out in a brief that went to the Oversight Committee within the hour, was that aggressive suppression of a witnessed public event at this scale would cost more in credibility than confirming a limited version of the truth would. What the limited version of the truth was going to be, and who was going to deliver it, was a conversation that was going to happen at levels above his authority, and he said so clearly in the brief. And then he went to the commissary to talk to Saitama because the Oversight Committee would take time and Saitama was here now. He sat down across from Saitama with a coffee he hadn't had time to drink yet and looked at him for a moment before speaking. Saitama looked up from the manga with the politely attentive expression he used when he recognized that someone wanted to have a real conversation rather than a procedural one. Landry said, "I need to ask you something straight." Saitama said, "Okay." Landry said, "Are you going to leave?" He said it without preface, and without the diplomatic layering that most of the conversations with Saitama had been conducted with, because he was tired and the coffee was cold, and he had learned in the last several days that Saitama responded to directness better than to careful framing. Saitama put the manga down and thought about the question with a seriousness that Landry recognized as genuine, because by now he had enough of a read on Saitama to distinguish performance from the real thing. Saitama said he didn't know how to get back, because the gate address that had brought him here didn't exist in the gate system as far as anyone had established, and going back through the gate at random seemed like it would probably take him somewhere different from where he'd come from. He said this without distress, factually, as someone reporting a logistical situation rather than expressing a problem. Landry said, "So you might be here for a while." Saitama said, "Probably," Landry said, "and more of these situations are going to happen." Saitama said, "Yeah, they usually do," and there was something in the way he said it, the patient, bottomless familiarity with the pattern of these things that landed on Landry with the weight of a complete understanding, which was that Saitama was not a weapon, was not an asset, was not a threat, and was not a solution. He was a constant. A fixed point around which the situations would orbit and escalate and eventually resolve, and the resolution would always look the same, and the galaxy was in the process of learning this the same way everything that had come before it had learned it. One damaged ship, one failed containment, one updated threat assessment at a time. In orbit, Kali's hatak had not moved. She had opened 3 more communication sessions with the SGC since the engagement, each one more substantive than the last, and the content of those sessions was moving in a direction that Carter had flagged to Landry as potentially significant. Kali was asking not about Saitama's capabilities, but about his origin, his world, his context, and the questions had the quality of someone trying to understand a phenomenon rather than exploit it. She had said in the 3rd session that if what Saitama represented was a category of being rather than a unique individual, then the galactic political situation had changed in ways that no current faction, Goa'uld, Tory, Free Jaffa, Takra, had a framework for yet. She had said this not as a threat or a negotiating position but as an observation, and Carter had written it down and looked at it for a long time, because it was exactly right, and exactly right observations from unexpected sources were the ones that tended to matter most. Baal's ship moved at 2300 hours, changing from its analytical orbit to a direct approach vector toward the SGC's coordinates, and he transmitted ahead of the approach this time, which was a change from his previous arrival style that everyone in the Situation Room noticed. He said he had completed his analysis. He said he had a proposal that differed significantly from his previous one. He said he was coming down to discuss it, and that he was coming alone, and that he would like, specifically, to speak with Saitama rather than with Landry first. There was a pause in the Situation Room, and then Landry looked at the camera feed showing Saitama in the commissary, still reading the manga, apparently unaware that he had just been requested for a meeting by the entity he had put through a wall 2 days earlier. And Landry said to the communications officer, with the particular exhausted equanimity of someone who has made peace with the fact that events are no longer operating in any sequence he anticipated, "Tell him yes." Baal arrived without ceremony this time, which was itself a kind of ceremony. The absence of theater from a being who had made theater a tool of governance for 10,000 years was a statement that everyone present read correctly as deliberate. He materialized in the SGC's secondary briefing room via ring transporter at 600, before most of the base's day shift had fully activated, in the particular quiet of early morning that made everything said in it feel more permanent than things said at other hours. He was not wearing the formal attire from the previous meeting. He looked, Carter noted, like someone who had not slept, which for a Goa'uld was unusual because the symbiote typically managed fatigue, and the fact that he looked tired meant that whatever he had been doing for the past 36 hours had cost something that the symbiote couldn't offset. He sat down at the table and folded his hands in front of him and waited. Saitama came in 2 minutes later with a cup of tea from the commissary, which was the beverage he had migrated to after deciding the SGC's coffee was not to his taste, and he sat down across from Baal and looked at him with the same mild, open attention he brought to everything. There was no tension between them in the way there is no tension between a mountain and the person looking at it. One of those things was a fixed feature of the landscape, and the other was a visitor who had decided to stop and look, and both parties understood which was which. Baal looked at Saitama for a moment before speaking, and what he was looking for in that moment was visible on his face to anyone who knew how to read it, which was that he was checking whether his revised model held up in person the same way it held up in analysis. And it did, and the confirmation of it settled something in his expression that had been slightly unresolved since the briefing room. He spoke for 20 minutes without interruption. What he said was not a proposal in the traditional diplomatic sense. It had no conditions, no asks, no architecture of mutual benefit through which he could extract advantage, which was so unlike Baal's operational method that Jackson, listening from the adjacent monitoring room, wrote the word unprecedented in his notes and underlined it 3 times. What Baal said was closer to a statement of fact with attached implications. He said that his analysis had produced a conclusion he was prepared to accept and act on, which was that Saitama's existence had made a particular category of behavior permanently non-viable across all the factions currently operating in the Milky Way galaxy. That category of behavior was the exercise of unchecked power as a form of governance, the fundamental operating principle of the Goa'uld System Lords, and to varying degrees of every other major power in the current galactic order. He said this not as a moral argument but as a strategic assessment, because Baal didn't make moral arguments and everyone in the room knew it. He said that the availability of a force that was neither technological nor political nor biological, that could not be matched, bought, negotiated with, or pointed at a problem through normal channels, meant that the value of unchecked power as a stable long-term position had collapsed. Not weakened, collapsed, Because the thing that made unchecked power stable was the absence of anything more powerful, and that absence no longer existed. He said, and this was the part that the monitoring room received in complete silence, that he was willing to withdraw his military presence from the territories he currently controlled in exchange for a formal acknowledgement from the SGC that Saitama was not a weapon under their direction. He said this was not a concession and was not a gesture of goodwill. He said it was the first rational response to a changed set of facts, and that any of the remaining system lords who processed the data he had distributed and arrived at the same analytical conclusion would arrive at the same response, and that the ones who didn't would demonstrate this through their actions, and that the SGC would not need to respond to those demonstrations themselves. He said this last part looking at Saitama, not at Landry or Carter or anyone with authority in the room, and Saitama looked back at him and nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone acknowledging a thing they've heard said correctly. Landry was brought into the room at the end of Baal's statement, and his response to being briefed on its content by Carter in the corridor was to stand very still for approximately 15 seconds while he processed it and then ask her, quietly, whether she thought Baal was telling the truth. Carter said she thought Baal was telling the truth in the specific way that Baal always told the truth, which was that every statement he made was accurate and the accuracy served his purpose, and that his purpose here was to position himself advantageously in a galactic order that had just shifted irreversibly, and that the shift was real regardless of whether his motivations were clean. Landry said that was a very precise way of saying yes and no simultaneously. Carter said that was because it was yes and no simultaneously, and this was a situation that demanded precision. The formal acknowledgement that Baal had requested was written by Jackson over the following 4 hours, in 3 languages, English, Goa'uld, and a neutral trade dialect that both parties' legal frameworks recognized. And it said, in essence, that Saitama was not acting under SGC direction, not a military asset, not deployed or deployable as a weapon by any government or institutional authority, and that his actions represented his own independent choices rather than any coordinated strategic policy. It was the most unusual document the SGC had ever produced, and it was also, Jackson noted, completely accurate, which made it the easiest document he had ever been asked to write in terms of the gap between what he was supposed to say and what was true. Saitama read it when Jackson gave him a copy, working through it carefully, and his only comment was that independent choices was a strange way to put it because he just did what seemed right, and Jackson said that was, in fact, exactly what independent choices meant. And Saitama said okay and put the copy in his pocket with the snack wrapper. Kali descended from orbit at noon, uninvited but not unexpected, and her meeting with the SGC lasted 3 hours and resulted in the opening of a formal communication channel that was not a treaty and was not an alliance, but was something that the diplomatic vocabulary of the Stargate universe didn't have a precise word for, a mutual acknowledgement of a new condition, entered into by parties who had no choice about the condition, but could choose how they oriented themselves to it. She left without committing to anything specific, but Carter's assessment of the session was that she would be back, and that the next conversation would be more substantive, and that Kali had done something that very few system lords ever managed to do, which was update her model faster than events required her to. Camulus's ship, repaired sufficiently for hyperspace transit, left Earth's solar system at 1400 hours without any communication to the SGC, without any acknowledgement of the events of the previous days, without anything except the departure vector itself, which pointed away from Earth at maximum safe transit speed. He did not contact Baal. He did not contact Kali. The silence of his departure was the loudest thing he said, and what it said was that he had no framework yet for what had happened and was going somewhere quieter to build one, and the SGC and everyone in it would deal with whatever version of Camulus that process produced at a later date. Saitama stood on the surface access road again at 1700 hours, in the crater landscape that was still being assessed for remediation by the base engineering team, and he looked at the sky in the early evening, the way he had looked at it before any of this had started, with the open, patient absence of expectation that was the most consistent thing about him. Mitchell came out and stood next to him after a while, not saying anything at first, just standing in the cold air looking at the same sky. After a few minutes, Mitchell said, "What happens now?" Saitama thought about it with genuine consideration, and then said that he supposed he would stay until he found a way back, and that in the meantime things would probably keep happening and he would deal with them when they did, and that was about as far out as he could plan. Mitchell said that was a very calm way to look at it. Saitama said he'd tried looking at things the other way for a while, and it hadn't made anything better or faster. It had just made the waiting worse. The Stargate network had been used for 10,000 years as the infrastructure of empire, the mechanism of control, the architecture through which gods and their servants moved armies and traded worlds, and enforced the order of things. It had survived the collapse of the Goa'uld Empire and the rise of the Tori and the arrival of the Ori and every other reconfiguration of galactic power that had passed through its address system. It had never in 10,000 years admitted anything that its rings couldn't stop and its categories couldn't classify and its political structures couldn't ultimately root into something manageable. What had come through the gate on a Tuesday morning wearing a white jumpsuit and rubber boots was none of those things. He was not a power to be balanced. He was not a threat to be contained. He was not an asset to be deployed. He was a fact, patient and permanent and mildly bored, standing in a crater in Colorado, waiting to see what would happen next. The galaxy was still learning how to exist in the same sentence as that fact. It was going to take a while. Saitama was fine with that. He'd been through worse. He just wished there was a better convenience store nearby.